Professor Lessig, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Could you please briefly describe for us the state of campaign finance laws before Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that seems to have changed everything?
Sure. So I'll describe before Citizens United. I'm going to quibble a bit about whether Citizens United changed everything.
Oh, okay.
But before Citizens United, you know, candidates raised money for their campaigns, and they were limited in the size of the contribution they could receive for their campaign. People ran political action committees that were also limited in the size of the contributions they could receive to the political action committees. And rich people under Buckley versus Vallejo were free to spend money independently of a campaign as much as they wanted. So,
okay.
Elon Musk in let's say in 2008, which was the election before Citizens United, would have been free to spend unlimited amounts of money independently of the campaign, whether it was for McCain or for Obama, because Buckley versus Vallejo had said, as long as the spending was independent, it could not be regulated. What Citizens United did was to say the same freedom that Elon Musk would have had in 2008, any corporation and union had after the decision in Citizens United, because campaign finance law had limited corporations and organizations like unions from spending above a certain amount independently of a political campaign. And what the court said in Citizens United was the same reasoning that said in Buckley that a rich person could spend unlimited amounts of money as long as it was independent of the campaign also applied to a corporation and to a union. So after Citizens United, people were free to spend unlimited amounts of money. The critical change—
I'm sorry, when you say after Citizens United, people, that definition of people now includes right. Corporations and unions, entities that are not essentially humans, beyond just right. Elon Musk. Okay.
Right. So Elon Musk, a corporation, Elon Musk Inc., Elon Musk Union, and Elon Musk Political Action Committee, all of those entities were free after Citizens United to spend unlimited amounts of money as long as it was independent of a campaign. Before Citizens United, only Elon Musk could spend unlimited amounts of money independent of a political campaign. Now, at that moment, there were still big problems with the way money affected political campaigns, because I wrote a book just at the time Citizens United was coming out, but it wasn't— the data of Citizens United didn't enter into the book. Where we estimated—
what was the title of the book?
That's Republic Lost.
Okay.
Where we estimated candidates for Congress and members of Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money. So if you spend 30 to 70% of your time raising money from a tiny fraction of the 1%, you can't help but be affected by the people you're raising money from. Whether it's you're aware of it or not, psychologically, you're going to be bent to favor the people who are giving you money and avoid doing things that will upset those people. And that's just the nature of humankind. So
that applies to both parties.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So we already had a bad system before Citizens United, but Citizens United opened the door to making it much worse. But it didn't do it itself. Instead, 3 months after Citizens United, there was a lower federal court, the DC Circuit, that decided a case called Speech Now versus the FEC. And what Speech Now said was, the question in Speech Now was not whether you could spend unlimited amounts of money. The Supreme Court had already decided that in Citizens United, but whether you were free to give unlimited amounts of money to a political action committee that would then spend unlimited amounts of money independently of a political campaign. So, you set up a PAC called, America's Future PAC. You raise $1 billion from 5 people, each of them giving $200 million to your PAC. Are you allowed to do that under federal law? Well, at the time, federal law said the most you can give to an independent political action committee, a committee that's going to spend its money independently of a campaign, is $5,000. And what the DC Circuit said in Speech Now was that limit, $5,000, was unconstitutional. And the reasoning on the surface sounds plausible, but when you think about it a bit, is plainly logically fallacious. So on the surface, the court said, Citizens United has just told us that there is no government interest in regulating speech that is independent of a campaign. And the reason for that is Buckley had said the only reason for regulating political speech was the risk of quid pro quo corruption. And so Buckley had said Elon Musk can spend unlimited amounts of money independently of a campaign because if it is independent, there is no quid pro quo. Or putting it the other way around, if there is a quid pro quo, it's not independent. So the point was, if it's independent, then there could be no basis for regulating it, which means it can be independent. It can be unlimited. What Speech Now said was, okay, if the spending raises no risk of quid pro quo corruption, then a contribution to the committee that's making the spending also logically, as a matter of law, creates no risk of quid pro quo corruption. Okay, that move is obviously wrong because the spending could be independent, but there's nothing to indicate that the contribution is independent. And indeed, 5 years later in New Jersey, Robert Menendez was indicted. Senator Robert Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, was indicted. The charge was he had engaged in a quid pro quo. He'd made an illegal deal with some rich guy from Florida. He said, I'll give you government favors. In exchange, you give my super PAC a bunch of money. So there was a quid pro quo involving a contribution to a super PAC. The thing that Speech Now had said was logically not possible. Indeed, the lawyers for Menendez had the chutzpah to file a motion to dismiss the indictment, saying the thing you've indicted us for, the DC Circuit in Speech Now said was impossible, could not happen. And of course, they didn't dismiss the indictment, but that motion presented the logical mistake that Speech Now had made. Now, that case was never appealed to the Supreme Court, but it began to convince a bunch of other circuits. And that's what gave birth to the super PAC, because what super PAC refers to is a political action committee that is not limited in the size of the contributions it can take. And those are political action committees that spend their money independently of a campaign. And so it's the super PAC that I think has changed politics dramatically, not the Citizens United money. There's relatively little independent spending by corporations. There's relatively, directly in a campaign. There's, some, but relatively little union spending independently of a campaign. The real dynamic is the dynamic that has produced super PACs, which have become the most polarizing and consequential speech in American politics today.
Professor Lessig, is the difference between the potential impact of super PACs versus what the example that you suggested, the hypo going back to my law school days about an Elon Musk contributing to a 2008 election, right? Let's say we didn't have super PACs. Couldn't you and I, two billionaires, still put our own money without turning it into an ink and still spend $2 million for Mr. Trump or Ms. Harris?
Yeah, it's a huge difference. It's a huge difference, but if you focus on Elon Musk, it looks like there's no difference at all.
Yeah, hence my question. Yeah.
So the reason it looks like there's no difference at all is that, Elon Musk gave a whole bunch of money to a PAC he set up. So if you said he couldn't give all that money to the PAC, but he could spend that money independently, he would just spend it independently. So there's a distinction without any difference. Okay.
Yeah.
But the biggest way super PACs achieve their power is essentially laundering the money that is contributed to those super PACs. So that people can give money to these super PACs, but the public doesn't realize that they've given money to those super PACs. And it's that relative anonymity that creates the great opportunity for these super PACs to grow so dramatically. Elon Musk doesn't want anonymity. He's eager to have people know that he's the one that's affecting all of these campaigns. And so his speech is not going to be changed if you got rid of super PACs. But most of the money that super PACs are spending, they are spending based on dark money. And there's dark money in the super PACs because though if Elon Musk gives his super PAC a bunch of money, he has to be named as the contributor. If another nonprofit gives the money to the super PAC, what's called a C4, political action committee that's allowed to spend money on campaigns, if the C4 gives money to the super PAC, then the C4 is listed, but nothing requires the C4's donors to be listed. So the donors don't have to be listed, which means the donors can hide their contribution, and that means dark money can flow into the political system without the people giving the money being identified or paying, whatever reputational cost or benefit they would get from identifying the money. So if you eliminated super PACs, you would substantially reduce the amount of these large contributions inside of politics. You wouldn't eliminate them, but you wouldn't eliminate them because people like Elon Musk, since 1976, the decision of Buckley versus Vallejo, have been constitutionally free to spend their money independently of a campaign.
So going back to the hypothetical the second hypothetical that I was talking about, you and I spending $1 billion each. There is a difference in this distinction with when it comes to spending our own money directly versus super PACs, because in super PACs, you and I could put our billions into a super PAC and no one would know.
Well, it depends on how we do it, but in principle, yes. I mean, we could, if you said, I wanted to be able to contribute money to your super PAC, I want to give you $1 billion, but I don't want anybody to know that I've given this money to the super PAC.
Yeah.
There's a pretty simple way to do that. And that is, you would set up another political action committee called a C4. You would create something called a C4. It's got a bunch of restrictions around it, but it's not really relevant here. That C4 would have to report that it received $1 billion contribution, but it wouldn't have to say who gave the $1 billion to that C4.
I see.
And that C4 then would contribute to my super PAC. And I would list the name of that C4, Political Action Committee to Make America Great. But I wouldn't list who contributed to that C4 because I don't necessarily know who contributed to that C4. So you could hide your $1 billion contributions through the C4 in a contribution to my super PAC.
Okay. I'm going to name some super PACs, and I want to make sure that I follow the thread of your conversation here, discussion here. And I think I share some of these with you. For example, Elon Musk's America PAC, $75 million. Miriam Adelson's Preserve America, $50 million. There's more. Trump 47, $145 million. Bill Gates just donated $50 million. If we go to some of these super PACs that I identified, they could have even, like Ms. Adelson or Mr. Musk, they could have either created a super PAC with their money, or they could have given it individually based on the discussion that we just had. For them, it wouldn't matter.
They could have been spending it individually.
Yeah.
What the super PAC does is, you go out and you set up a super PAC. The super PAC hires, really competent political advisors and media people. It's like a little mini campaign.
Yeah.
the super PAC's not really doing anything in that story because you could be doing that independently. You could just be setting up your own campaign independently. So the Elon Musk super PACs are kind of single donor super PACs,
Yeah.
which would be the same. If you eliminated super PACs, they would spend their money independently of the super PAC. So that wouldn't make any difference. But and I don't have the breakdown yet for this period because we don't have the data yet. But the vast majority of super PACs are not transparent like that. Like we don't know exactly who the contributors are because they're able to hide their contributions. And if they hide their contributions, then they don't pay any political price. I mean, one of the reasons why Citizens United turned out not to be as significant as some of us thought it would be is that, the narrow thing Citizens United said is you as a corporation are free to spend your money, as much money as you want, independently of the campaign. But federal law requires you identify that you're spending the money. Okay, so Target, for example, spent a whole bunch of money supporting an anti-gay candidate for governor. I think it was in Minnesota. They found their Target stores around the country picketed by gay activists who were like, why are you spending our money to support an anti-gay candidate for governor? And so what they quickly discovered was the high price of free speech, that if they took on these political causes, they would suffer in the marketplace. And so they realized that it wasn't worth it for them to take on these political causes openly because it would be too costly for them in the marketplace. So the amount of money that is spent under Citizens United is really small. Instead, if they want the money to be spent in politics, they give it to a super PAC through a C4. And when they do that, then the money can be spent, but they don't pay the price. Nobody knows that it's Target or whatever company might be giving that money.
If I may interject here for a moment to make sure that I'm following. So let's say I'm a gay activist and I see that Target is spending money against a pro-gay or a gay candidate. And I get upset and I picket Target and I stop spending money. Now, Target sees this. They could funnel that same amount of money through a C4, as you were just describing, to a super PAC. Now, I don't know Target is doing this. I go about my merry way, spending my money in Target.
That's right.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, that's the whole thing.
I could be funding the very people that are against my principles.
Exactly right.
Oh, wow. We'll be back after a short break to talk about fighting super PACs and corruption. Professor Lissig, I had queued up a question to ask you, but after the prior segment, it may be a moot point. I'll ask it and we can go from there. Are there any efforts to undermine or overrule Citizens United? Perhaps we should sort of stretch this question to go to the speech case that you were talking about as well.
Yeah. So, most people don't recognize the distinction between what Citizens United did and the existence of super PACs. So, my friend Bernie Sanders will say, super PACs have been a disaster for American democracy, therefore we have to overturn Citizens United. And while I certainly agree super PACs have been a disaster for American democracy, and I also agree that overturning Citizens United might be sufficient to end super PACs, it's not necessary to end super PACs. Whoa. And the reason is it wasn't Citizens United that created super PACs. It was Speech Now, a case never appealed to the United States Supreme Court. So right now, or on election day in 2024, in the state of Maine, there's an initiative, Question 1. Question 1 directly contradicts Speech Now. It says, contributions to independent political action committees can be limited to just $5,000 or must be limited to just $5,000. So if
you and I are billionaires, we can't give $1 billion to the super PAC anymore.
Yeah, you can't. If there's a political action committee in Maine that's spending money on Maine elections and it wants to raise money, then it can't raise more than $5,000 from any individual.
Okay.
And so if that initiative passes, it's certainly going to be challenged. And if it's challenged, then it will first go to the First Circuit Court of Appeals, which has never addressed the question of whether super PACs are constitutionally required or not. And our view is that the First Circuit Court of Appeals will agree that nothing in Citizens United blocks the state of Maine from regulating contributions to independent political action committees. And the reason for that is, as the story about Robert Menendez shows, even if the spending of the committee is independent of the campaign and can raise no risk of quid pro quo corruption, the contribution to the committee could easily involve quid pro quo corruption, and the committee would know nothing about it, right? So you're running a political action committee, independent political action committee. I ran a super PAC once. It was a super PAC to end all super PACs. So let's super PAC, receives $1 million contribution. And I call the donor and I say, thanks for the contribution. I don't know anything about what led to that donor sending me the $1 million contribution. It might have been that a politician said, I'll do you a favor, a government favor, if you send $1 million to that super PAC. So the point is that politician making that deal with that rich person to send money to my super PAC is quid pro quo corruption. And so that deal is exactly what the Supreme Court has said is the danger that allows the government to limit contributions to committees or to candidates. So we believe the First Circuit will understand that reasoning and say, under Citizens United, you can limit contributions to independent political action committees, even though you can't limit the spending of independent political action committees. And if they hold that, then that case will go to the United States Supreme Court. And in the United States Supreme Court, the argument will be, we want you to apply your existing jurisprudence to a set of facts you've never considered. So your existing jurisprudence says you can limit contributions if there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption. Well, here's a risk of quid pro quo corruption with contributions to independent political action committees. You therefore should allow us to limit those contributions. And if the court applies its principles to this set of facts that's never considered, the court should hold that you can limit contributions to independent political action committees, thereby ending super PACs. Now, again, that wouldn't stop Elon Musk or George Soros or anybody else, any other rich person you want to identify who wants to
Koch
spend their money
brothers or what have you.
Yeah, but it will stop super PACs from being able to receive unlimited contributions to support or oppose political candidates.
But in the case of, I'm just repeating what you said before, in the case of, let's say, George Soros, Elon Musk, Koch brothers, whatever, that they're donating.
Yeah.
That's the big difference.
You at least have transparency to make it clear that they're the ones that are donating.
And I'm not going to.
They're spending. They're not donating. That's the point. They're spending their money.
Yes.
They're not giving it to any committee. And it's the giving to a committee that creates the risk of this corruption.
And then you can make a decision how to handle that. I'm not going to buy any more Teslas or whatever your decision is. As one of the things, this is a bit tangential, but I remember from my law school days that when I think of the Citizens United case, it's not the decision that a corporation can spend so much money may not be so earth-shattering, because from law school days, I remember a person in the legal sense includes a legal entity, right?
Yeah. I mean, so much of the resistance to Citizens United was grounded on the idea that the court spoke as if corporations had natural constitutional rights, or they had rights granted to them under the Constitution, as distinct from rights given to them by the legislature. Like the legislature could say, we're going to treat a corporation as a legal person, except we're going to limit what that legal person can do, including spending money in a political campaign. That wouldn't be a problem to recognize that as a legal person, because it's a creation of the legislature. But what the courts seem to suggest is that the corporation wasn't just a legal person in the sense that the legislature could make them a legal person, The court spoke as if the corporation was a legal person under the Constitution. And that reached back to decisions in the late part of the 19th century that recognized corporations as persons under the 14th Amendment. Okay, but as Justice Scalia said in his concurrence in Citizens United, this is all a non-issue, because the issue under the First Amendment is not whether you're a person or not a person. The issue is whether Congress is regulating speech or not. And if Congress is regulating speech, then Congress needs a good justification for that regulation. And the only justification they had recognized is quid pro quo corruption. And there is no quid pro quo corruption with independent speech. So whether they're a person or not, Scalia said, they still couldn't be stopped in their speaking here, because the stopping them is not related to a compelling governmental interest. So, and I think that that point has some merit. I do think that it's a mistake to think that corporations have rights because of the Constitution, separate from, the derivative rights they have because humans actually own them, right? So,
Yeah.
if the government wants to come and take my car, the government has to pay me for it. Or if it wants to come and take my property, it's got to pay me for it. We could say that corporations have no constitutional rights. That doesn't mean that the government can come take the corporation's land and not pay for it.
Yeah.
If it took the corporation's land, then we would say, well, there are owners to that corporation whose property you've taken, so you got to pay the owners to that corporation. So it would be the same result. It would just be a little bit messier legally. And I think that would be a perfectly fine solution to the problem. But I do think it's kind of missing the point. The point of Citizens United was simply to say, if there's no risk of corruption, the government can't regulate the speech. And the converse of that, if there is a risk of corruption, then the government can regulate the speech. And so if the government can regulate the speech when there's a risk of corruption, they ought to be able to regulate the speech under super PACs because there's a risk of corruption with contributions to independent political action committees.
That sounds very logical. Was Citizens United sided along party lines, the 9 justices?
Yeah.
Why would that be, though?
I mean, that court was beginning to be the kind of partisan court that we have, that people sort of see right now in the Supreme Court. I think it was really, the swing vote there was really just motivated by recognizing basically the same principle had been articulated by Buckley, 40 years before, in 1976. So Buckley had said, rich people can spend unlimited amounts of money so long as it's independent. There was no reason that the justices on the court saw between distinguishing a rich person, Elon Musk, and Elon Musk Inc. They were the same from their perspective for the government's interest in limiting them. And, that Citizens United was a kind of, still exists, is a kind of nonprofit political corporation, right? It advances political causes. And, that they leverage that to say, it doesn't make sense the government's allowed to suppress political speech by a political organization just because it's a corporation. Because we all understood it couldn't limit political speech by an individual. That's what Buckley said. So why is political speech by a corporation different? And what triggered Justice Stevens, who wrote the really compelling dissent, was corporations are created by the state and they have enormous power because of the privilege of limited liability that they get. And so you're creating this huge power that's going to speak in ways that could distort the political system. But the majority didn't think that was a relevant interest for deciding whether this type of speech could be regulated.
You mentioned corruption several times. We talked about, for example, quid pro quo and Senator Menendez. Do we have institutional corruption in America in a big way? And when I say institutional corruption, Professor Lessig, I sort of immediately think of Middle East, countries in South America or in Africa. I don't know, Germany, England, France, or the US don't are not in the forefront when I think of that. So what's
Well, I think it depends on how you want to think about institutional corruption. So let's go back to the framing of the Constitution. The framers of our Constitution spoke incessantly about quote unquote corruption. They would call the British Parliament corrupt.
hmm,
By calling the British Parliament corrupt, they didn't mean that members of Parliament were taking bribes. They weren't talking about quid pro quo corruption.
hmm,
What they were talking about was the fact that the king, through what was called the Rotten Borough system, could basically select certain members of Parliament to be members of Parliament. And that was corrupt because the idea of Parliament was to be independent of the king. The king was not supposed to be able to pick members of Parliament by controlling the boroughs, the rotten boroughs where these members could run. So it was an institutional corruption in the sense that this institution was meant to be independent of the king, but the king had effectively corrupted it by saying that part of it would be filled by the king. And so therefore that institution was
oh,
institutionally corrupted. So there's a similar way in which our Congress has been institutionally corrupted. So Madison told us that Congress would be, quote, dependent on the people alone. And
hmm.
he clarified by the people, he meant not the rich more than the poor. Okay, so dependent on the people, not the rich more than the poor. Okay, but we've set up a system for electing members of Congress where the first thing they must do is to raise unbelievable amounts of money to be able to run their campaigns. So they are dependent on the funders of their campaigns in order to have the ability to run for Congress. Okay, but the people they're dependent upon are not the rich more than are the rich more than the poor. I mean, it's not poor
My
people.
$500 doesn't compete with Mr.
Yeah.
Musk's $75 million.
Million. Right, right. Or, you can give up to I think I remember what the numbers are for this election cycle. Let's say it's $6,400. You can give up to $6,400 or $6,600 in a primary and a general election to a candidate. If I give $6,600 and you give $50, the candidate is dependent on the people who are giving $6,600 more than the people giving $50.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they're dependent on the rich more than the poor. And so it's a corruption of the design of our representative democracy because we've created an improper dependence inside of our representative democracy. And so in that sense, I think our representative democracy has been corrupted by money, not necessarily because of the quid pro quo, but because we have a Congress that is obsessively focused on what funders care about, and the funders do not represent the people. The funders are a tiny fraction of the
Yeah.
1%.
And this goes back way before Citizens United.
Yes, of course. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a problem created by the way we raise money for campaigns. And we could do it differently. Like, the city of Seattle gives out vouchers to all its voters. And the vouchers, like $25 per voucher, the voters can then give to candidates. So the candidates basically raise their money from voters from these vouchers. And then they take the vouchers and they cash them in and they use that to run their campaign. Well, that's a system where the funding is coming from all the voters, and all the voters are relatively equal in what they're giving because they have the chance, they all get the vouchers. And that would produce a system where you were dependent not on the rich more than the poor, you're dependent on everybody equal, just like you're dependent on everybody for the vote. So there are lots of other ways to fund campaigns that don't create this corruption, this institutional corruption. But the system we have right now is certainly institutionally corrupt in just that sense.
Are any politicians seriously talking about fixing this?
Well, so long as super PACs exist, the answer is not much. And the reason for that is, if you had a public funding system, whether it's the voucher system or the way presidential campaigns used to be funded, which is once you were the nominee, you got a check from the government to run your campaign. Or in Connecticut, you have For state offices, you have a matching system. And like once you qualify, then you get a check from the government to run your campaign. All of those systems are defeated by super PACs because nobody's going to opt into these systems when somebody else can get, $50 million contributions from rich people to compete against their publicly funded campaigns. So super PACs have made the public funding movement much weaker because the funding is small compared to the super PACs.
Yeah.
But
Why
if you
would you
eliminate,
opt in for that? Yeah.
right. But if you eliminate the super PACs, then it certainly could make sense to opt into these public funding systems. So when Connecticut passed its public funding system, 78% of existing representatives opted into that system in the first year because they would rather be doing their job than raising money. And if they could get their money from the public funding system, they would much prefer that over, cocktail parties or things like that. So if you get the numbers right, a public funding system without super PACs can certainly replace the corrupt private funding system that we've got right now. But nobody's pushing for that much right now because they see super PACs as an insurmountable barrier
Yeah.
to getting an effective public funding system going.
Yeah. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Professor Lessig as we get into the perspective. Professor Lessig, we discussed super PACs and institutional corruption. Have we been here before in our nation's history? I mean, it's a pretty gloomy picture that you painted, which is, I mean, we read about this all the time in the news, but is this new?
Well, we've seen versions of this before. As democratic politics, small d democratic politics, grew in the 19th century, and immigrants moved to the United States and became part of the political process. Party systems, machines in the cities grew to be able to rally and turn out voters. And that on its own doesn't sound bad. Like you create a political machine, the Democratic machine, the Republican machine, to organize your voters and turn them out. The problem is that businesses quickly realized that a good way to get the kind of regulation they wanted was to basically buy the political machine. Yeah, so the machines would sell out to the corporations, the businesses, and so that when the politicians were elected from the machine would make sure the politicians would return the favor to the businesses. So basically, business corrupted the party machines so that the party machines served the interest of business, not the interest of the public as a whole. The progressive movement, which was building at the end of the 19th century and early into the 20th century, began to identify this corruption as a deep flaw with American democracy. And you had reformers from both parties who were attacking big money's role inside of the campaigns. It's kind of ironic because somebody like Teddy Roosevelt, who became associated with quite aggressively taking on the power of big money, was himself elected to office with big money, right? So there was no, this was not a pure birth. It was like a dirty process that got him to the place that he could lay down the gauntlet and begin the fight. But the point is, there was a substantial amount of reform in the political system to try to break the power of the party bosses. And it did break the power of the party bosses, and patronage and civil service reform made it so that they had less control, and so they were less valuable to the businesses, and businesses wouldn't easily be able to buy them off the way they had before. But the kind of corruption we've seen emerge today is much more systematized and kind of blatant in its effect.
Blatant, okay.
Yeah, in the sense that, in the late part of the 19th century, it's not really obvious how much politicians are worrying about the raising of money to fund their campaigns. People would describe life in Congress back then, I mean, all the way until the 1970s, to be, for a year and a half, you worked as a congressperson, and then for a half a year, every 2 years, you would run your campaigns, right? So things got done for a year and a half, and then for a half of the year, there was like the election cycle. And so during the year and a half, you just figured out, what should I do? And then for the election cycle, you were focused on how do I get the resources I need to be able to run.
So
Well,
for a year and a
now,
half, you actually legislated, you actually
yeah,
worked, and then you
yeah,
went. That's
yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
But now, basically from the moment you're elected, you are raising money for the next election. Like literally the night you are elected, you're sending out emails to your followers and saying, like, we need to
Oh.
raise money for the next election. And so there's a kind of persistent discipline of members of Congress now to be constantly focused on how what they're doing might affect their ability to raise money. They kind of develop a sixth sense, constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. And they become shapeshifters to kind of adjust their views to make sure that their views are the kind of views that will either raise money or not drive money away. And so I think that discipline, in a kind of Foucauldian sense of that word, is much more effective today than it would have been way back in the day. And that's largely because the amount of money necessary to be engaged in politics has just risen so dramatically.
With social media, I want to ask, with the advent of social media, I want to ask a question about uh, a phrase you used going back to the 19th century, said political bosses. And I hope I'm not butchering this. I think of people from Tammany Hall. Am I saying that
Yeah,
correctly?
yeah.
Um, and it goes back all the way to the 1950s to the 1910s. And so, um, based on my readings, do we have political bosses still? Or has it all been fractured because of social media and super PACs and all of that?
Well, it's certainly the case that at big cities at the local level, there's still a lot of political bosses that control access to patronage or government favors, and so that exists not at the level or with the efficiency that it did in the late part of the 19th century.
Yeah.
So, Chicago, I understand councilmen have a chunk of money they're allowed to give out for local programs or local things. Well, that money is not, given out in a perfectly clean way. Like there's a kind
Yeah.
of quid pro quo that gets. So in that sense, that still exists, but it's not the kind of control. Like there's no boss Tweed today who's
Yeah.
running Chicago the way Mayor Daley ran Chicago. The old Mayor Daley, not his son, for so many years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but the technique, what I think is interesting is to think about how the technique of control is still the same. So Boss Tweed used to say, I don't care who does the electing as long as I do the nominating. And the genius in that was that he realized that if he was the person who determined who could run, doesn't matter who gets elected, the person who gets elected is going to depend on him and do what he wants because he's the one that decides that they're allowed to run. Well, there's a kind of Tweedism today, because if you
Huh.
think not of Boss Tweed, but of big money is basically saying, I don't care who does the electing, like let the people vote. As long as I'm doing the nominating, meaning I'm the one who decides who get to run. So big money basically gets to decide which candidates are going to run because they're deciding who they're going to give their money to, and they give money to the people who are going to make money happy. So the tiniest fraction of the 1% have replaced Boss Tweed, but they basically have the same power Boss Tweed had because they get to call the shots for the kinds of candidates who are going to be able to compete in the general election. So you have a candidate,
That's
you know,
fascinating.
you have candidates who wants to come on and say, we're going to radically change the power of the super wealthy in America, like Bernie Sanders, for example,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
AOC. They're going to find it very hard to run in most districts around the country because they're going to need money to run,
Yeah.
but they're not going to get any money because they're taking on big money. So that dynamic is the same. It's just it's not located in a single colorful figure, Boss Tweed. It's now located in the class of people, the funder class, who are funding the campaign.
So there could be Americans that do want to run that are more qualified, but they
Oh
don't
yeah,
have the. So in the old days, they didn't have the support of the political bosses because they didn't put those qualified candidates in front of people. And now the super wealthy, the 1%, whatever you want to call them, they're in effect doing the same thing. That is very interesting. So let me just ask that question one more time. Do you think we're in a particularly dangerous moment for our democracy because of all of this? Or has this happened before?
Well, I think we're in a much more dangerous moment than in any moment in the past, but not just because of the money. There are two other things we have to put on the table to see
Mm-hmm.
why things are so dangerous right now.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that's very different right now is the fractured media and the ability or the business model of media, which is trying to drive engagement, and it drives engagement by being as polarizing and negative as it can be. So that creates a much more fractured public. We don't even see the same facts anymore because we see them from our own political perspective. And of course, the same fact looks radically different if you're on the left or on the right.
Yeah.
So that's one big difference. And the other big difference is the public is more relevant today. So, when Boss Tweed was
Huh.
exercising his power, the public was basically invisible. And that was because we had no polling when Boss Tweed was exercising his power. So, we would elect people to Congress, and the members of Congress would say, well, my people back in my district think A, B, and C, but there was no way to know what the people in the district actually thought. And so the members of Congress basically got to do what they wanted to do. They got to legislate and govern kind of free of the ongoing discipline of their public. Well, now the public's views are persistently available to the legislators, and constantly constrain what they can do. So after January 6th, there were many
But this
Republicans.
second point sounds like a good thing.
Well, so on the
I'm sorry
surface,
I interrupted you. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
it sounds like a good thing
Yeah.
until you realize that we're talking about a public that's been polarized. So they've been polarized through incomplete information given to them by this media that's just trying to engage them. And also when you realize, the public may have a view, but the public, also has a job. It's got life, it's got to live. So
Yeah.
its view is not necessarily an informed or complete view. So they are the most important force in American politics, but it's an increasingly ill-informed and polarized view that has this effect in American politics. So I think these three things together are the kind of perfect storm for democracy. Number one, you've got this extraordinary amount of corrupting money. Number two, you have a media infrastructure that makes it so we don't even see the same facts. And number three, the public that's produced by that media infrastructure is even more present and important to what our government does than it ever was in our past. And those three things together make it very hard for the government to do anything sensible if it's seen in a political or a partisan way.
If you wanted our audience to remember just one point after everything we've talked about super PACs, what would that one point be?
Super PACs are not given to us by the Constitution or the Supreme Court. And we have a real shot to get the Supreme Court to agree that legislatures or Congress can eliminate them. And if people begin to believe that, they will be much more interested in working to make that happen. So, in Maine, I'm hopeful they will pass this initiative. Then there'll
Yeah.
be 2 years of litigation to get this initiative up before the United States Supreme Court. But I hope by that time, people begin to recognize almost as common wisdom that this type of speech can be regulated by legislatures or Congress, and we can get rid of the corrupting influence of super PACs in our politics.
Professor Lessig, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so much, Professor Lessig.
Thank you.